Hi everyone, Matt and Tom back with you. Today we're in Barton Upon Humber. We've just headed over the Humber Bridge from Hull to get here. How would you feel if you found out that your next door neighbour or the person you married was a notorious murderer on the run? How would you feel if that person was an inspiration for one of the most notorious horror films ever made that happened here in Barton? Marie Langley was a widow who lived here on Whitecross Street in the late 80s. She'd lost her husband, but rather than spend time being lonely, she decided that the best thing she could do is to become pen pals with people. Now this is the days before internet, etc. So she would write and see what responses she got. One of those responses she got was from a man whose address was a prison in Texas. That man's name was Robert Elmer Kleason, and he claimed that the reason he was listed as being in a prison in America was actually because he was a professor, a live-in professor at the jail, teaching other students. So Kleason and Marie Langley wrote to each other for quite some time, for a few years, until 1991 it was arranged that Kleason would come over to visit Langley for a holiday. So Kleason arrived in Barton and he came to spend his holiday with Marie Langley. But Kleason ended up stopping here for the next 10 years. Kleason had some quite remarkable claims about who he was when he arrived here. He claimed to be a CIA operative, a Korean War veteran. He said he'd shot down MiGs in the war. He also said that he was responsible for the assassination of Che Guevara. They seemed quite bold claims, but he had medals with him, which kind of proved that he said what he said was who he was. But almost as soon as he arrived, things started to take a strange turn indeed. Because only 4 months after arriving for this holiday, Marie Langley was getting married to this American, Robert Kleason. The fact is, Robert Elmer Kleason was not quite who he said he was to the people of Barton. He was not a CIA operative. He was not a Korean War veteran. He was, in fact, the man who many claim inspired the horror film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Let's wind the clock back to 1974 and see exactly who Robert Elmer Kleason was. 1974, Austin, Texas. Robert Kleason lived in a trailer behind a taxidermist shop in Oak Hill. The people at the taxidermist would show Kleason how the machinery worked, how to cut up animals, etc. Kleason had appeared in Texas in 1974. At the time, the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal had unsettled the American way of life. To the people in Austin, Texas, he said he'd been a fighter pilot, a CIA operative, a Korean War veteran, and was responsible for the assassination of Che Guevara. He joined a church group and became a baptized Mormon. However, he was caught hunting buffaloes, which was an illegal activity, and jailed for 5 months. The church helped him, but Kleason was ungrateful. The Mormon missionaries continued to visit him, despite Kleason seemingly angry at what he thought had been a lack of support. 2 missionaries in particular regularly visited: 20-year-old Gary Darley and 19-year-old Mark Fisher. They were keeping a diary of their visits, and they seemed to grow uneasy in his continued company. The Mormons, however, soon discovered that the man who claimed to be a war hero was actually a former patient of a mental hospital, a hoarder of firearms, and on the run from the police. Robert Kleason was born 20th of September 1934 in Buffalo, New York. In 1950, the 16-year-old Kleason had stepped on a rusty nail and his mother took him to the hospital. Whilst there, he hit his mother, returned to the car and got a gun, which was in the boot. He returned to the hospital and started shooting. He was placed in a psychiatric facility until 1952. In 1971, he shot a man called Dennis Dubois in the foot and fled to Texas. He had had 3 previous marriages. The last one ended after his wife found him taking a bath with a mutilated deer. Kleason had started to write a series of letters threatening the church. The bishop of the church demanded the visits to Kleason stopped, but the 2 missionaries decided to make one final visit on the 28th of October 1974. Neither of the boys were ever seen again. As the missionaries never returned, and as the bishop had knowledge of where they were likely to have been, the police swooped on Kleason. On arrest, he seemed to change personalities, claiming the missionaries had never arrived, but evidence pointed to Kleason, as, after searching the trailer, the police found an ID badge with a bullet mark, both their watches and keys, and they were stained with blood. The investigators pieced together what might have happened. They believed that the missionaries had been shot. They also, in the trailer, found a book written by Kleason of how to kill, dissect and dispose of animal carcasses at the taxidermist. They then examined the taxidermist's studio next to Kleason's trailer. On a saw that was used to cut up animals, they found hair that matched the two missionaries. Kleason had dissected them with the saw and thrown the body parts into a place with animal body parts that would be mulched into fertilizer. They realized that their heads must have been decapitated and sliced into pieces with the bandsaw. Kleason was put on trial. He was found guilty of murder and the death sentence was passed. Kleason spent the next 3 years on death row and was known as the real Texas Chainsaw Killer. Kleason appealed the death penalty before it was carried out. A legal technicality gave Kleason a glimmer of hope. The appeals court decided that the initial search warrant was invalid and illegal, and the evidence from the initial search had to be deleted from the files. The death sentence was revoked and a retrial granted. But now, with all the initial evidence that was found in that search unable to be used in the trial, Kleason was instead found guilty of firearms charges and jailed for 9 years instead. And after those 9 years, he was a free man. So in 1988, Kleason was released from prison. On his release, the man thought to be the man who carried out a very real Texas Chainsaw Massacre found himself in the news again, as the local people in Texas did not want this man back in the area for fear he would murder again. He was featured on the news nearly every night as to where his whereabouts were at that particular time, and he had to be moved into a safe house. However, once his parole was complete and his passport was returned to him, Kleason fled to England to meet up with his pen pal from Barton upon Humber. So back to the early 90s, where Kleason was in Barton and he was charming the local population here with his stories of being a CIA operative. What he did next was he took an interest in hunting and joined a local gun club. Whilst he was there, he applied for a license and he was granted one. Kleason claimed he had no previous convictions and he was given his license to not only own guns but to deal in them as well. So he started again to hoard weapons in his house. Kleason's house became full of guns and ammo, and soon he also started to threaten his wife with the guns. At this point, Marie Langley realised she'd made a huge mistake. Kleason would also beat her and moved her into a back room of the house. She was a prisoner of the house for the next 5 years. The once popular Kleason had started to create suspicion amongst the people of Barton, specifically the members of the gun club, kept noticing changes in his personality. One such change occurred when he was confronted by one of the members of the gun club, and in retaliation to what he'd been told, he put a loaded gun into the face of the member of the club. This saw Kleason arrested, but he was released without charge, and he managed to keep his license for his gun once again. because of the fear he was now creating within the gun club due to his erratic behaviour. One of the members wrote to the Medal of Honor Society to ask about the Congressional Medal of Honor that Kleason had worn to his wedding. The reply was quite a surprise. The reply he received said Robert Kleason was a fraud. So he confronted Kleason with his findings. Kleason naturally responded with a death threat if the info ever got out. However, the member of the gun club had already contacted the police. The police made contact with Interpol and received information about Kleason's past firearms offences. However, it didn't mention his conviction for murder. The police raided Kleason's house and confiscated 42 guns that were on the premises. Kleason started to draw up a hit list of people because he was so angry at his guns being confiscated. Around this time as well, he mysteriously moved a bandsaw into his property. Now, as a few years had passed, the internet had suddenly arrived, and the people in this area started to do their own searches on Robert Kleason. One of them was very surprised to find out that the man in Barton was a previous member on death row in Austin, Texas. Now realizing how dangerous Kleason actually was, thoughts turned to his wife Marie, what danger she was in and how they could rescue her from Kleason's clutches. And then, one day, Marie Langley disappeared. Fearing that Marie Langley had met her end at the hands of Kleason, the police were called to the house. There they found more weapons. Kleason was arrested, and he was once more back in the news as his past life returned to the headlines. But in actual fact, a friend of Marie had rescued her, and she'd done an early morning escape that told no one what had happened. It was found that she'd moved to a safe house about 50 miles from Barton. In March 2000, Kleason was charged with illegal possession of guns. His wife divorced him. However, Kleason was allowed bail and returned once again to Barton. Kleason had started writing again to pen pals, this time one in Germany, and planned his escape. Kleason headed to Hull docks with this German woman he'd written to, now his fifth wife. But as they reached the docks, he was arrested and jailed for 3 years for gun possession. Whilst he was in jail, there were plans made to send Robert Kleason back to the USA, as new evidence had been found in the 1974 missionary murders, due to DNA evidence being better understood 30 years later. However, before this happened, Robert Kleason, on the 21st of April 2003, passed away at 70 years old. Okay, so that is the story of Robert Elmer Kleason, possibly a real life Texas Chainsaw Killer. Did he inspire the movie, or did the movie inspire him? They were both happening about the same time, so it's questionable. But I hope after 20 years that people here in Barton managed to move on from those events, although unfortunately, because of the nature of the story, it is a story that's likely to be told for years to come. Okay guys, we will see you very soon for the next video. Take care. Bye for now.